The whip of claws tore through the night air, and Sigrid Emberholt hit the ground hard enough to taste blood. "Get up," someone hissed above her. "Get up and shift, wolfless girl, or crawl home like the nothing you are." She didn't move right away. The frost-hardened dirt of the trial circle bit into her palms, and above her, a ring of torches lit 100 watching faces, all of them waiting for her to fail. Again. Before the story gets even better, press like and comment your location below. It's always incredible seeing people from all over the world watching together. Now, let's continue. This was the trial of the Silver Moon, held once every year in every pack across the 5 kingdoms. Every wolf-born child, on their 18th year, stepped into the circle beneath the full moon and let their second skin rise. Fur, fangs, 4 legs and a howl that shook the tree line. It was supposed to take a heartbeat. For Sigrid, it had taken nothing. Not once. Not ever. Pathetic, someone laughed. Brynja, daughter of the pack's second, always led the laughing. 3 years running the same shame. Someone should just put her out of the pack for good. Sigrid pushed herself up onto shaking arms. Her knees screamed where a boy named Toft had shoved her down to help her concentrate, which really meant he wanted an excuse to hurt her without consequence. Nobody protected the wolfless. Nobody had to. Breathe, she told herself. They can knock you down. They cannot make you stay down. She stood, swayed, stood straighter. There's nothing left to see, said Elder Fenn, not unkindly, but final all the same. He was the one who ran the trials, an old wolf with silver in his beard and pity in his eyes, which was somehow worse than cruelty. Sigrid Emberholt, daughter of Rurik and Astra Emberholt, you have failed the trial for the 3rd and final year. By law, you are marked wolfless. You will carry the grey cord from this day, and no pack shall be required to shelter you beyond your 18th winter. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some pity, mostly relief that it wasn't them. The grey cord. She'd seen it on beggars at crossroads and outcasts who slept in ditches. A rope the color of ash, tied around the wrist of anyone who couldn't call their wolf. It meant you were less than a person here. It meant you were a warning to other children about what happened when the moon didn't answer you back. "Wait," Sigrid said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "My parents were healers. They saved half this pack from the fever winter 6 years ago. Doesn't that count for anything?" "Your parents are dead, girl," Brynja said sweetly, "and dead healers don't keep the living warm." Laughter again. Sigrid felt her face burn, felt the old grief for her mother and father claw up her throat where it always lived, banked like coals under ash. They had died within a season of each other when she was 12. Her father first, a hunting accident nobody would describe in detail, and her mother 6 months later of what the healers called a wasting sickness that took hold overnight and never once slowed down. Sigrid had never quite believed either story, but grief doesn't care what you believe, it just sits on your chest and waits. Elder Fenn was already reaching for the grey cord, and that was the moment the horn sounded. Not the pack's horn. Not any horn Sigrid had heard before. Low and long, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once, rolling down off the ridgeline like a wave of sound that made every torch in the circle gutter. "That's a border horn," someone whispered. "That's a king's horn." The crowd turned as one. Through the tree line, shapes were moving. Huge, 4-legged shadows breaking from the dark, resolving into wolves the size of small horses, silver and black and iron grey, running with a discipline no ordinary pack ever kept. They didn't slow at the edge of the trial circle. They didn't ask permission to cross into Emberholt land. They simply arrived, and the crowd scattered back from them like water from a dropped stone. At the front of the pack, the largest wolf of all skidded low, and rose from the change without a sound. No scream, no shudder, just a man unfolding out of fur as easily as breathing. Tall. Broad through the shoulders in a way that made the space around him feel smaller. Dark hair. A jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than born. And eyes, pale gold, like a wolf's eyes caught in a man's face, still faintly glowing with the change. Sigrid didn't need anyone to tell her who he was. Nobody in the Five Kingdoms needed telling. Alpha King Tyon Draven, ruler of Ashfall, the largest and hardest realm north of the mountains. A man who had put down 3 rebellions with his bare hands and buried a queen 6 years ago and never taken another. A man who, rumor said, had 8 sons and no living mate, and had crossed exactly 0 borders for anyone in 6 long years. Tonight he had crossed 3. "Your Majesty," Elder Fen stammered, dropping into a bow so fast his knees cracked. "We were not told to expect. I didn't send word," Tyon said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, the kind of voice that didn't need to rise to silence a crowd. His gaze swept the trial circle once, cataloguing every face, and then stopped. On her. On the girl with dirt on her knees, and a grey cord dangling, unfinished, from an elder's hand. "Sigrid Emberholt," he said, not a question. The crowd's murmur died into something closer to silence. "I don't understand," she managed. "Your Majesty, I don't. How do you know my name?" Tyon Draven walked toward her, the way storms walk toward a coastline, slow and inevitable and impossible to look away from. He stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his eyes, and for one terrifying second, she thought he might simply be here to confirm a rumor and leave in disgust, the way everyone eventually did. Instead, he said, "Because I have spent 3 months and crossed 3 borders looking for you." "Me," she repeated, and it came out cracked. "I'm Wolfless. I failed the trial 3 times. There is nothing in Ashfall that could possibly need someone like—" "There is," he said, "everything." Behind him, a scarred woman with silver-streaked hair had also finished her change, watching the crowd with the flat readiness of someone who expected trouble and would enjoy ending it if it came. And a younger man, sharp-eyed and restless, was already looking Sigrid over the way a merchant looks over a horse he intends to buy. "I have 8 sons," Tyon said, quiet enough now that it felt almost private, though every ear in the clearing was straining to catch it. "The oldest is 17, and furious at the world. The youngest is 3, and doesn't remember his mother's face. I did not come here tonight for a bride to warm my bed or fill my nursery. I came because 3 months ago, a healer in my court found an old record. Your mother's name, tied to a bloodline my court believed had died out a generation ago. A line that matters far more than any of these people standing here understand." His eyes didn't leave hers. "And because everywhere I sent riders asking about you, I heard the same word." "What word?" Sigrid whispered. "Unbroken," he said. 3 years of this circle, telling you that you are nothing, and you still stood back up tonight before I even reached you. That is rarer than a wolf, Sigrid Emberholt. That is rarer than a crown." Elder Fen found his voice. "Your Majesty, surely you don't mean to take a wolfless girl to—" "I mean to ask her," Tyon said, without looking away from Sigrid, "and I will hear the answer from her mouth, not yours." The grey cord fell from the elder's slack fingers and hit the dirt, forgotten. Sigrid stood in the center of the trial circle, the same circle that had just finished declaring her worthless, and looked up into the eyes of a king who had crossed 3 borders to find her, and felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with grief at all. "Ask me then," said. And the Alpha King of Ashfall smiled like he'd been waiting years to hear exactly that. The arrow came out of nowhere, and it would have taken Sigrid's throat if Ravenna hadn't slammed her sideways off the trail, a heartbeat before impact. They hit the ground together, in a tangle of cloak and dirt, and the world exploded into motion. Wolves, Tyon's escort, burst from the tree line in 3 directions at once, snarling, while a second arrow thudded into the trunk, exactly where Sigrid's head had been. Somewhere ahead on the trail, Tyon's black and silver form was already a blur, closing distance on something in the dark faster than her eyes could track. "Stay down," Ravenna barked, blade already in hand, scar pale in the moonlight. "Stay down, girl. This isn't your fight yet." It was the 3rd day of the journey north, and until this moment it had been almost peaceful. Long hours in the saddle, The strange quiet of a king who spoke little and watched everything. The restless energy of Doran, his nephew and strategist, who rode ahead scouting bends in the road like he expected an ambush at every one of them. Apparently, he'd been right too. The skirmish lasted less than 2 minutes. When it was over, one attacker lay unconscious and bound at Tyan's feet, wearing no house colors, no packmark, nothing that named him. The others had melted back into the dark, the way trained fighters do when a job has gone wrong. Tyan crouched in front of the bound man, human again, chest heaving, eyes still faintly lit gold with the fading edge of the change. "Who sent you?" The man spat blood and said nothing. "Who?" Tyan said again, and something in his voice made even Sigrid's skin prickle. "Sent you?" "No house," the man finally rasped. "No pack. Just coin. That's all I know. Coin. And a description of a girl with a grey cord that never got tied." Tyan went very still. "They knew about the cord before it happened," Doran said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "Before the trial even finished. That's not coincidence, Uncle. Someone's been watching her for longer than we have." Tyan's jaw tightened, but when he turned to Sigrid, his voice gentled in a way that startled her more than the ambush had. "Are you hurt?" "No," she managed. "Ravenna got to me first." "Good," he said, and for one unguarded second, something that looked almost like fear crossed his face before he folded it away again. He turned back to the prisoner. "Take him to Ravenspire. I want him questioned properly, not by a knife on a forest road." Later that night, at a way station too small to be called a fortress and too fortified to be called anything else, Sigrid sat wrapped in a borrowed cloak, staring at the fire and trying to stop her hands from shaking. Ravenna found her there. "You're wondering why anyone would pay coin to kill a girl nobody in the 5 kingdoms thought was worth a second glance 3 days ago," Ravenna said, settling onto the bench across from her without asking. "That obvious? You've got the look. I've worn it myself." Ravenna turned her blade over in her hands, more habit than threat. "Your mother's name meant something once, before you were born. Astra Emberholt wasn't just a healer, girl. She came from a line the old texts call Moon Wardens, bloodlines that could shield a pack from more than sickness, curses, old magic, the kind of thing kings used to go to war over, back when anyone still believed in it. My mother never told me any of that. Maybe she didn't get the chance." Ravenna's eyes softened, just slightly. "Maybe she was trying to keep you safe from exactly this." Sigrid's throat tightened. "You think that's why she died? And my father?" Ravenna didn't answer that directly, which was its own kind of answer. "I think the king has spent 3 months turning over stones nobody else thought to look under, and tonight something crawled out from underneath one of them and tried to put an arrow in your neck. Draw your own conclusions." Across the small camp, Tyan stood apart from the fire, arms crossed, watching the dark tree line like he expected it to move again. Sigrid found herself watching him instead, the tension in his shoulders, the way he hadn't sat down once since the ambush, the way his eyes kept flicking back to her, quick and checking, like a man reassuring himself something precious was still where he'd left it. She rose and crossed to him before she'd fully decided to. "You knew this might happen," she said, "didn't you? That's why you came for me yourself, instead of sending riders." Tyan was quiet for a long moment. "I suspected there might be interest in you that I didn't understand yet. I didn't expect it to move this fast." His gold eyes found hers. "I should have told you before we left your pack's land. I'm sorry I didn't. You barely know me." "I know enough," he said, "to know you deserved the truth, and I withheld it anyway, because I was afraid you'd refuse to come if you understood what you might be walking into." He exhaled, something unguarded slipping through the crack in his composure. That was a poor way to begin trusting each other. It was such a strange thing. A king, admitting fault to a girl 3 days removed from being handed a grey cord. Sigrid didn't know what to do with it, so she said the only true thing she had. "I'm still here," she said, "ambush and all. That should tell you something too." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close enough to be its shadow. "It tells me," he said, "that my scouts chose better than even I hoped. They rode the rest of the way to Ravenspire in careful, watchful silence. But it was a different silence than before, one with something new threaded through it, fragile and unnamed, that neither of them was ready yet to speak aloud." The training yard went silent the moment Sigrid stepped into it, and 8 pairs of eyes turned on her like she'd walked into a den of wolves who hadn't decided yet whether she was prey. Because, in a way, she had. She'd been at Ravenspire Keep less than an hour, long enough to see the towers of black stone rising out of the cliffside, like something grown rather than built. Long enough to be shown to rooms so large her entire childhood home could have fit inside the sitting room alone. Not long enough to meet the reason Tyon Draven had crossed 3 borders in the first place. "There you all are," Tyon said, and for the first time since she'd met him, Sigrid heard something almost like nervousness under his usual iron calm. "This is Sigrid. She'll be staying with us." The eldest stepped forward first, 17, built like his father, with the same set jaw and none of the warmth. "Staying," Torvin repeated, flat, "or replacing." "Torvin," Tyon started. "No, it's fine," Torvin cut in, eyes fixed on Sigrid like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be met. "I just want to understand. We had a mother. She's gone. Now there's a stranger in her rooms, 3 days after father rode out chasing rumors, and we're supposed to call that fine." Sigrid's chest ached, but she kept her chin level. "I'm not trying to replace anyone." "Good," said the second eldest, 15 and colder than the winter wind off the ridgeline. Cassian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because you couldn't. Twin boys of 13, Bram and Roswin, exchanged a look Sigrid was fairly sure meant trouble, and one of them, she genuinely could not tell which, grinned without a shred of welcome in it. "We give the last 3 governesses 2 weeks before they cried and left," Bram, or possibly Roswin, said cheerfully. "You've got a kind face. I'm putting money on 9 days. 11, said the other twin. "She's got stubborn eyes." A boy of 11, with unsettlingly calm grey eyes, Edric, simply watched her, silent, cataloguing, the way Rowan had watched Kara, in the story his own life would never know it echoed. Beside him, a 9-year-old with dirt permanently ground into his knuckles, Soren, didn't look at her at all, already turning back toward the stable block where, she'd learn later, he kept an entire secret menagerie of things the world had broken and he'd decided to fix. A 6-year-old named Wulfric peered out from behind Cassian's leg, wide-eyed, and said nothing. And the smallest, 3 years old, dark curls, clutching a carved wooden wolf missing one ear, simply looked up at Sigrid with the frank, unguarded curiosity only very small children ever managed anymore, and said, "Are you going to leave like the others?" The training yard went quiet enough to hear the wind. Sigrid crouched down to his level, ignoring the ache in her knees from 3 days of hard riding, ignoring 7 pairs of older, wearier, more hostile eyes watching her do it. "What's your name?" "Tobin," he said. "Well, Tobin," Sigrid said. "I don't know yet. Nobody knows the future, but I know I don't like being told what I'll do before I've had the chance to prove it myself. So how about this? You watch, and I'll show you, instead of either of us guessing." Tobin considered this with the profound seriousness only a 3-year-old could summon, then held up his broken wolf. His ear fell off. "I can fix that," she said, "if you'll let me." He handed it over without hesitation, and behind her, she heard Torvin make a small, disgusted sound and stalk off toward the practice ring, Cassian a beat behind him, unreadable as ever. The twins wandered off debating the terms of their bet. Edric lingered a moment longer than the rest, studying her with those 2 old grey eyes. "Torvin was the one who found Mother," he said quietly, before she could ask what he meant. "After. He was 14. He hasn't let anyone close since. Not really. Not even Father. He just got better at hiding it than the rest of us." He paused. "I thought you should know before you decide he hates you." "He doesn't. He's just afraid of losing someone again. and being angry is easier than being afraid. Then he too was gone, leaving Sigrid alone in the yard, with a broken wooden wolf in her hands, and the sudden, overwhelming understanding that she had not simply been brought here to be a king's companion. She had walked into a house built entirely out of grief, and every closed door in it belonged to a child who had already learned, the hard way, exactly how much it cost to hope. That night, unpacking the single trunk she'd brought north, Sigrid's fingers closed around something at the bottom, wrapped in an old scarf that still, faintly, smelled of her mother's herb garden. A locket. Silver, tarnished with age, engraved with a symbol she didn't recognize. A crescent moon wrapped around a closed eye. She had never seen it before in her life, and yet holding it, some small, wordless part of her chest recognized it instantly, the way a body remembers a room it was born in but never consciously saw. She turned it over. On the back, in her mother's careful hand, 5 words had been scratched into the silver, worn nearly smooth from years of some unknown thumb tracing over them. For when she is ready. Sigrid sat very still in the enormous, unfamiliar bed, in the enormous, unfamiliar keep, and understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air, that her mother had known something was coming, long before any king had ever ridden south to find her. The scream cut through the afternoon like a blade, and Sigrid was running before she'd even fully registered whose voice it was. Wolfric's in the river. Soren was already sprinting ahead of her, faster than she could match, shouting over his shoulder. The current took him past the mill wheel. He can't swim that far. He's 6. Sigrid's lungs burned as she tore across the water meadow below Ravenspire, her boots sliding on wet grass, her mind screaming that she had no wolf speed to close this distance, no claws, no strength beyond what her own 2 human legs could give her. For one terrible second, every year of being called nothing rose up in her chest and told her she would arrive too late, that a girl who couldn't even shift had no business trying to be the one who saved anybody. She ran faster anyway. By the time she reached the riverbank, Soren had already flung himself in, without a second's hesitation. A 9-year-old boy who trusted animals more than people, now thrashing through white water after his little brother, with more courage than sense. Wulfric's dark head bobbed once near the rocks by the old mill wheel, pulled under by the current, and came up gasping, too far from either bank. Soren, the rope! Sigrid screamed, spotting the coil of mooring line looped on a fence post nearby, used for tying the small boats the kitchen staff took upriver for fish. She didn't think. She grabbed it, looped one end fast around the sturdiest post she could find, and waded into the freezing water up to her waist, letting the current drag at her skirts as she fought toward the boys. "Hold on to him, and don't let go," she shouted at Soren, who'd finally reached his brother and had a fistful of Wulfric's tunic in a white-knuckled grip, both boys being pulled steadily toward the churning water beneath the mill wheel. Sigrid threw the rope. It fell short. She waded deeper, water at her chest now, cold enough to steal the air from her lungs, and threw again. This time Soren caught it. "Pull yourselves toward me, hand over hand. I've got the other end anchored," she shouted, praying the post held, praying her own numb arms would hold the tension long enough. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, all 3 of them were locked in a silent, brutal contest against the river, Soren dragging his terrified little brother hand over hand along the rope, Sigrid bracing her whole weight against the current to keep the line taut, her feet slipping on the stony riverbed. Then Wulfric's small, cold hand closed around her wrist, and she hauled him bodily out of the water and up onto the bank, Soren scrambling out a heartbeat behind him, both boys coughing and shaking and alive. Sigrid collapsed onto the grass between them, soaked through, arms trembling, and pulled them both against her without thinking, the way she imagined a mother might, the way nobody had held her since she was 12 years old. "You're all right," she gasped, half to them, half to herself. "You're both all right." Wulfric, who had said perhaps 4 words to her total since her arrival, buried his face against her shoulder and cried the way children cry when the fear finally catches up to them after the danger has passed. Soren sat rigid beside them, staring at the river, at his shaking hands, and said, very quietly, "I couldn't have pulled him out alone. The current was too strong." "You didn't have to," Sigrid said. "You went in anyway. That's what mattered." By the time the household staff arrived, alerted by a stable hand who'd seen the commotion from the yard, Wulfric was wrapped in Sigrid's cloak and refusing to let go of her hand, and Soren was carrying his little brother's rescued shoe like it was something sacred. Tyan arrived last, and fastest. Sigrid saw him coming across the meadow at a dead run in wolf form, changing back mid-stride in a blur that should have been impossible, and the look on his face when he saw all three of them alive and upright on the riverbank was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Not relief exactly, something rawer than that, something that looked, for one unguarded moment, like a man who had genuinely believed he was about to lose someone and hadn't yet caught up to the fact that he hadn't. He didn't say anything at first. He simply crossed the distance and pulled all three of them, his two sons and the wolfless girl he'd crossed 3 borders for, into one arm each, kneeling in the wet grass, breathing hard. "I had no wolf to give them," Sigrid said later that evening, once the boys were dry and warm and finally asleep, sitting across from Tyan, in the small solar off the family wing, still wrapped in a blanket someone had pressed into her hands. "I couldn't shift. I couldn't run as fast as you, or fight the current the way a wolf could. I just did what I could with what I had. That's the only kind of courage that's ever mattered," Tyan said quietly. "The kind that shows up anyway, without the guarantee of strength to back it. I've commanded armies of the strongest wolves in 5 kingdoms, Sigrid. Half of them freeze the instant the fight turns against them. You waded into a flooding river with nothing but a length of rope and sheer stubbornness. Soren's the one who went in first. Soren's 9 and reckless and takes after his mother in that particular way," Tyan said, something fond and pained crossing his face. "But he trusted you enough to shout your name instead of running for a guard. That's not nothing. That's the first time any of them has trusted a stranger with something that mattered in 6 years." Sigrid looked down at her hands, still faintly pruned from the river. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd hesitated. If I'd stood on that bank and thought about how useless I am without a wolf, the way I've thought it my whole life." "But you didn't hesitate." "No," she admitted, surprising herself with how true it felt to say it aloud. "I didn't." Tyan studied her for a long moment, firelight catching gold in eyes that no longer looked quite so unreadable to her as they had 4 days ago. "I am beginning to think," he said slowly, "that I did not simply find the one bloodline that could shield this house from an old enemy. I think I found something this house needed far more urgently than that." Sigrid didn't ask him what he meant. She was fairly certain, sitting there soaked and exhausted, and strangely, unexpectedly happy, that she already knew. The training blade shattered on impact, and for one horrifying second, Sigrid thought Torvin was dead. He wasn't. But the sword had snapped clean at the hilt mid-strike, and the jagged edge had opened a gash along his forearm, deep enough that blood was already soaking through his practice sleeve by the time Sigrid reached him, shoving past the guard who'd been sparring with him, dropping to her knees in the dirt of the yard. "Someone get Helena," she snapped, pressing both hands hard against the wound, ignoring how her voice shook. "Now." "It's fine," Torvin gritted out, pale-faced, trying and failing to pull his arm back. Blade snap. "It happens." "Not like that. It doesn't." Sigrid had grown up watching her mother tend wounds. She knew the difference between a clean break and a blade that failed because something was already wrong with it, long before it ever crossed another. She held the pressure steady until the healer arrived at a run, and only once Torvin was safely bandaged and glaring at his own arm, like it had personally betrayed him, did she pick up the broken hilt from the dirt and turn it over in her hands. The metal at the breakpoint wasn't jagged the way honest steel failed. It was thin, filed down, carefully, from the inside, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. "This didn't happen by accident," she said quietly. "Doran, who'd come running at the commotion, took the hilt from her and studied it with the same sharp attention he gave everything, his earlier boredom entirely gone. "You're right, someone weakened this on purpose." His jaw tightened. "Which means someone inside these walls had access to the armory, knew Torvin's training schedule, and wanted him hurt. Or worse," Ravenna said grimly, arriving in time to hear the last of it. A blade failing mid-strike against a moving opponent could just as easily have taken an eye, a throat. This wasn't a warning. This was meant to do real damage. Torvin, still pale from blood loss, but sitting up now, looked between the three of them with dawning, furious understanding. "Someone in my father's own household tried to hurt me." "We don't know who yet," Doran said. "But we will." That evening, Sigrid sat with Torvin in the quiet of the family wing, while Helena finished her final check of the wound, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Ravenspire, he didn't look at her like an intruder in his mother's rooms. "You noticed the blade was wrong before anyone else did," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Even Doran needed you to point out where to look. My mother was a healer. I grew up watching her tell the difference between a wound that happened and a wound someone caused." Sigrid hesitated. "I'm sorry this happened to you. I've spent 5 days being cold to you," Torvin said abruptly, like the words had been building pressure behind his teeth and finally cracked loose. "Since the day you arrived, I told myself it was because you didn't belong here, because father moved too fast, because none of us asked for this." He looked down at his bandaged arm. "But it wasn't really about you. I was the one who found her, my mother. I was 14, and I walked into her rooms to ask her something stupid about supper, and she was all ready." His voice caught, and he forced it steady again. "Everyone kept telling me it would get easier. It didn't. It just got quieter. And every time father brought someone new home, some part of me was waiting to have to walk into another room and find another person who wasn't there anymore. It felt safer to hate you before that could happen again." Sigrid's chest ached with a grief she recognized far too well. "I lost both my parents too," she said quietly. "Different ways, both sudden. I understand what it costs to let yourself hope someone's going to stay, and then watch that hope get proven wrong. Do you think it was proven wrong? For you?" "I think," Sigrid said carefully, "that today, when that blade broke, I didn't think twice about whether it was my place to run to you. I just ran. That has to mean something." Torvin was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. "It means," he finally said, "that maybe I owe you an apology instead of a grudge." He met her eyes properly for the first time since they'd met in that hostile training yard 5 days ago. "I'm sorry, Sigrid, for all of it." "You don't have to apologize for being afraid," she said. "I understand that better than almost anyone alive." Later, standing on the ramparts with Tyan, as the sun sank behind the western ridge, Sigrid relayed the whole exchange and watched something in his shoulders loosen that she hadn't even realized had been rigid. "Someone inside these walls means my son's harm," Tyan said, low and dangerous. "Someone I trust enough to have given them access to my own armory. That is not a small thing to carry." "We'll find them," Sigrid said. "Doran's already narrowing the list of who had access to that blade rack." "We," Tyan repeated softly, and there was something almost wondering in the way he said it, like the word itself was unfamiliar to him, after 6 years of carrying every burden of this house entirely alone. "I don't think anyone has said that word to me, and meant it since Elowen died." "I mean it," Sigrid said, and found, with some surprise, that she did, completely and without reservation, in a way that had nothing to do with prophecy, or bloodlines, or the reasons he'd first ridden south to find her. Tyan turned to look at her fully, gold eyes warm in the dying light, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. Sigrid woke gasping, the locket clutched so tightly in her fist that its edges had bitten into her palm, her heart slamming against her ribs like something trying to escape. The dream had been vivid in a way dreams never were, not fragments, but a single unbroken memory that wasn't hers. Her mother's herb garden at dusk, her father's voice, low and urgent, saying a name she didn't recognize. Malric, her mother's hands shaking as she wrapped something small and silver in an old scarf and hid it at the bottom of a travel chest, whispering, "If anything happens to us, she has to have this. She has to know what she carries before he finds her first." Then darkness, and cold, and a stranger's voice saying, "The Wolfless line ends tonight, one way or another." Sigrid sat in the dark of her enormous, unfamiliar bed for a long time before she trusted herself to move. She found Ravenna in the practice yard before dawn, already awake, already sharpening a blade she didn't strictly need sharpened, the way people do when sleep refuses to come. "I need to know everything you know about moon wardens," Sigrid said, "and about a name, Malric." Ravenna's blade stilled entirely. "Where did you hear that name? A dream, or a memory, I don't know which." "My mother hid this." Sigrid held up the locket, "because she believed someone was hunting our bloodline, and she thought it might find me eventually, even if she didn't survive to explain why." Ravenna set down her whetstone and studied Sigrid with an expression that had gone entirely serious. "You should hear this from the king, not from me." They found Tyon already awake in his study, a habit Sigrid was learning he rarely broke, poring over correspondence by lamplight with the exhausted focus of a man who trusted almost no one else to carry his kingdom's weight for even a single night. He looked up when they entered, and whatever he saw on Sigrid's face made him set down his quill immediately. "Tell me," he said. So she did. The dream, the locket, the name that had settled into her chest like a stone, dropped into still water. Tyon went very still. Beside him, Ravenna's jaw had tightened into a hard line. "Malric Thorn," Tyon said finally, "was my half-brother." Sigrid's breath caught. Same father, different mothers. He believed, for most of his life, that Ashfall's throne belonged to him by right of being firstborn, regardless of the difference in our mother's standing. When our father named me heir, instead, Malric didn't accept it quietly. He spent years building quiet alliances, testing loyalties, waiting. Tyon's hands curled into fists on the desk. 6 years ago, Elowen, my first queen, discovered evidence he was planning to move against the throne. She brought it to a council of trusted healers to have verified before she brought it to me, because she wanted proof strong enough that even his allies couldn't deny it. "My mother was one of those healers," Sigrid whispered, understanding crashing over her all at once. "That's why he came for our family." "I believe so, yes," Tyon said grimly. "Elowen died a month after that council met. Officially, illness. I never fully believed it, but I had no proof, and a grieving king, chasing shadows, makes for a weak king in the eyes of every rival, watching for exactly that kind of stumble. Malric vanished from court not long after, and has spent 6 years rebuilding influence in the shadow kingdoms beyond my borders, quiet enough that even my best spies lost his trail entirely. Until 3 months ago, when reports of a Moon Warden bloodline surfacing in the south reached my ears at almost exactly the same moment, his old network started stirring again. "He's the one who sent the archer," Sigrid said, "and weakened Torvin's blade." "I believe so," Tyon said, "which means he already knows exactly who you are and exactly what your bloodline means, and has decided you are dangerous enough to remove before you fully understand your own power." His gold eyes met hers, dark with something between fear and fury. "I should have told you all of this the night I found you. I let myself believe there would be time to explain slowly, gently, without frightening you before you'd even had the chance to feel safe here. That was a mistake, and I am sorry for it." Sigrid absorbed all of it in silence. The weight of a dead queen, a vanished traitor, a curse laid on her family that had stolen both her parents and quite possibly her own wolf. Rage and grief tangled together in her chest until she couldn't easily separate them. "What does it mean," she finally asked, "to be a Moon Warden? What am I actually capable of?" "Old texts say your bloodline can shield a pack from curses no ordinary wolf magic can touch," Ravenna said quietly. "And that a true Warden's wolf doesn't rise the way an ordinary wolf's does, through moonlight and instinct alone." It rises through something stronger, a cause worth more to you than your own safety. That's why I've never been able to shift, Sigrid said slowly, the pieces settling into place with an ache she hadn't expected. Not because I'm wolfless, because whatever I've needed to break it free hasn't happened yet. Tyan rose from behind his desk and crossed to stand in front of her, close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his eyes, the way she had that very first night in the trial circle. I did not bring you here only to shield my house from Malric, he said, low and rough. I want you to hear that clearly, and believe it completely. I came to find you because of a report and a bloodline, yes. But I have stayed beside you these past days, because somewhere between a flooded river and a broken sword, and a girl who refuses to stay down no matter how many times this world has knocked her flat, I stopped thinking of you as a shield for my sons. His hand rose, hesitant, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. I started thinking of you as someone I could not imagine this house without. Sigrid's heart hammered against her ribs, and this time it had nothing to do with fear. Malric wants me removed, she said quietly, because he understands exactly what I could become if I let myself. Then let's make certain, Tyan said, that when the moment comes, you become it. The grand hall of Wintermere fell silent the moment Lord Howard rose from his seat, and Sigrid felt every eye in the room shift toward her like a tide going out before a wave. Forgive my bluntness, Your Majesty, Howard said, addressing Tyan with the smooth, poisonous courtesy of a man who had rehearsed his cruelty in advance. But the Council of Five Kingdoms has gathered to discuss border treaties and shared defense, not to bear witness to whatever this arrangement is meant to be. His gaze slid to Sigrid, standing at Tyan's side in a gown of deep blue that felt, in this moment, like armor made of silk. A wolfless consort seems a curious choice for the strongest throne north of the mountains. One wonders what message it sends to every pack watching this summit, that strength no longer matters, so long as a king's heart is sufficiently softened. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through pockets of the hall. Sigrid felt her face heat, felt 18 years of the exact same mockery rising up to choke her, and made herself breathe through it instead of shrinking from it, the way she had learned to do standing in 100 trial circles that had never once been kind to her. Careful, Howard, Tyan said, and though his voice didn't rise, it carried through the hall with a weight that silenced the laughter instantly. You mistake softness for something else entirely. Ask my son Torvin, who is alive today because this woman noticed a poisoned blade before it could take his arm or his life. Ask my sons Soren and Wulfric, who are both breathing because she waded into a flooding river with nothing but a length of rope and refused to let the current win. His gold eyes swept the hall, daring anyone else to speak before he'd finished. Strength is not only claws and fangs, my lord. Strength is standing back up after this world has told you, over and over, that you are not worth the effort of getting back up for. I have watched armies of the strongest wolves in 5 kingdoms break under far less pressure than this woman carries every single day without complaint. Halvard's smile thinned but didn't disappear. A pretty speech, though I notice it does not answer the concern itself. A Moon Warden bloodline, resurfacing now, at your side, at the exact moment old rumors of your brother's ambitions have begun stirring again in the Shadow Kingdoms. Some might call that a curious coincidence. The hall went very still. Sigrid felt Tyan tense beside her, and understood, with sudden clarity, that this was not idle cruelty. Halvard knew something, or had been told something, by someone who wanted this exact accusation planted in front of every ruler in the 5 kingdoms. She stepped forward before Tyan could answer for her. My lord, she said, and was faintly amazed at how level her voice came out. You speak of coincidence, as though someone in this hall might have reason to want King Tyan Draven distracted, and his household divided, at precisely the moment old enemies grow bold again. She let that settle, watching understanding and alarm flicker across several faces in the hall who clearly hadn't considered the accusation from that angle. I did not choose my bloodline, my lord, any more than you chose yours. I was called Wolfless my entire life by people who mistook my silence for weakness. I would ask this council to consider whether it is wiser to interrogate the woman who nearly died defending this king's children, or the shadows that have been trying, quite persistently, to see her removed before she ever reached this hall at all. A murmur moved through the assembled lords. Not laughter this time, but something closer to consideration. From the back of the hall, a cloaked figure Sigrid hadn't noticed before shifted, just slightly, and for one brief moment before he mastered his expression, she caught something in his face that didn't match the polite, neutral interest of the other watching lords. Something sharper. Something patient, and cold, and deeply, personally interested in exactly how this exchange concluded. She didn't know his name yet, but something in her chest, some old, wordless instinct that had never once had a wolf's senses to rely on, told her to remember his face. Later that night, in the guest quarters afforded to Ashfall's delegation, Tyon found her still awake, staring out at the unfamiliar city beyond the window. "You handled Halvard better than most seasoned diplomats in my court could have," he said, settling beside her. "I've had 18 years of practice being told I don't belong somewhere," Sigrid said. "Turns out that's useful training for a room full of lords who think the same thing about my bloodline instead of my wolf." Tyon was quiet for a moment. There was a man near the back of the hall, cloaked, hood raised even indoors. "I noticed him watching you more closely than the debate warranted." "I noticed him too," Sigrid admitted. "Something about him felt wrong, familiar, and wrong at once, though I know I've never met him." Tyon's expression darkened. "Malric wore a hood, the last time I saw him in person, 6 years ago. A habit from childhood. Our father always favored me publicly, and Malric hated being recognized as the brother who came second." He met her eyes. It could be nothing. A watchful lord, curious about the controversy of the evening. "Or it could be him," Sigrid finished quietly. "Come to see for himself what he's been trying so hard to have removed." Neither of them said the rest of it aloud. That if Malric had come this close, this openly, into a hall full of witnesses and allied kings, it meant he no longer felt the need to hide in shadows. It meant he believed the time for subtlety had already passed. The scream from the kitchens sent half the household running, and Sigrid arrived to find Cook doubled over a spilled tureen of stew, gasping, her face grey and her hands shaking uncontrollably. "She only tasted it," a kitchen girl was sobbing. "She only tasted it before it went up to the nursery, and then she just—" "Get Helena, now," Sigrid ordered, already dropping to her knees beside Cook, checking her pulse, her breathing, the pallor spreading up from her lips. "And nobody touches that stew. Nobody." By the time Helena arrived and confirmed what Sigrid had already begun to suspect, a slow-acting poison, one that would have taken effect hours after the meal was served, long after anyone thought to trace the cause back to supper, the kitchens had been sealed, and Doran's expression had gone the particular flat, controlled calm of a man barely containing fury. "That stew was headed for the nursery," he said, "for Wulfric and Tobin's supper tonight." Sigrid's stomach turned to ice. "Cook will recover," Helena said, working quickly. She only tasted a spoonful before the reaction hit her, and it seems built to work slowly on a small child's body, not quickly on a grown woman's. If she'd sent it up untasted, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. It was Doran who found the answer by nightfall, grim-faced, laying it out for Tyon and Sigrid in the quiet of the study, with the particular precision of a man who took no satisfaction whatsoever in being right. "Steward Rennick," he said. 20 years of service, spotless record, trusted with keys to half this keep, including the kitchen stores. I pulled the ledgers on a hunch. 3 payments over the last 4 months, routed through a merchant house that doesn't exist under any name we can trace. Money in exchange for information. Schedules. Who ate where and when. Which rooms Sigrid favored in the evenings. Which nights the guard rotation thinned. Doran's jaw was tight. He's been Malric's eyes inside these walls since before Sigrid ever arrived. Tyon's expression had gone deadly still. "Where is he now?" "Gone," Doran said. "The moment the stew was discovered, he vanished. My guess is, he knew Cook's habit of tasting anything bound for the nursery, and hadn't accounted for it slowing the poison's effect enough to be caught. He panicked, and ran before we could connect the threads. Sigrid sat very still, the full shape of it settling over her like cold water. Someone she had passed in the corridors dozens of times. Someone who had bowed politely and wished her good evening, had been feeding information to the man who murdered a queen and cursed her own family into silence, and had come within a single spoonful of poisoning 2 children in this house who had only just, cautiously, begun to trust her. He would have hurt Tobin, she said quietly, or Wulfric. Children who never did anything to Malric, except exist in a house he once destroyed. That is precisely the point, Tyon said grimly. Malric does not care who he hurts to reach his goal. He never has. He wants this house divided by grief, the same way it was divided 6 years ago, because a grieving house is a weak one, and a weak house is easier to take. Sigrid rose and crossed to the window, arms wrapped around herself, watching the dark tree line beyond the walls. He's not going to stop with a poisoned stew and a broken sword and an archer in the woods. He's going to keep coming, closer each time, until either he's stopped or he isn't. I know, Tyon said, coming to stand beside her. I'm afraid, she admitted, and it cost her something to say it aloud. 18 years of learning, never to show weakness in front of anyone who might use it against her. Not for myself, for them. For 8 boys who've already lost one mother to this man's ambition. I don't know if I could survive watching that happen to any of them a second time. Tyon's hand found hers, steady and warm. Then we make certain it doesn't. Not through hiding, and not through waiting for him to choose the next attack. Through ending this, once and for all, on our terms instead of his. How? Malric wants you removed because he's afraid of what your bloodline could become once it's fully awake, Tyon said. That fear is the only weapon we need. We stop protecting you from the danger, Sigrid, and we let him come to us instead, on ground we've chosen, surrounded by people who love you enough to make certain he never leaves it. Sigrid turned to look at him, heart pounding, and felt something settle into place inside her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. Something that felt, for the first time in her entire life, like readiness. Then let him come, she said. The attack came at dusk, exactly as Doran had predicted it would, through the eastern gate, where the old stonework had been quietly weakened over months by a steward who'd known every crack in Ravenspire's defenses better than the guards who patrolled them. Sigrid felt the horn sound through her whole body before she consciously registered the sound of it. By the time she reached the courtyard, wolves were already pouring through a breach in the eastern wall. Malric's mercenaries, faces hard and unfamiliar, moving with the brutal efficiency of soldiers who'd been paid well and told exactly what they were here to take. They're heading for the nursery wing, Ravenna shouted, already changing. Already a blur of silver fur and bared teeth crashing into the nearest attacker. Sigrid, get the little ones to the cellar, now. She ran. Behind her, the courtyard had dissolved into chaos. Tyon's massive black and silver form locked in combat with 2 wolves at once. Torvin, fighting at his father's side, with a fury that had nothing left in it of the grieving, guarded boy from the training yard. Cassian's usual cold precision turned into something lethal and controlled as he guarded his younger sibling's escape route. Sigrid burst into the nursery wing and found Edric already herding Wulfric and a sobbing Tobin toward the servants' passage, Soren right behind them, a garden knife clutched in one white-knuckled fist like it might actually be useful against trained mercenaries. "This way," she gasped. "The cellar. We can bar the door from—" The wall exploded inward. Not from an attacker's charge, from something else, something that hit with the force of a battering ram and sent stone and splinters flying across the room. Through the dust, a cloaked figure stepped into the wreckage of the nursery wing, and this time he didn't bother keeping his hood raised. Malric Thorne looked almost gentle, in a way that made him more frightening rather than less. Pale eyes, a face that carried faint traces of his brother's features gone somehow colder in the shaping. He looked at the children first, then at Sigrid, and something like satisfaction crossed his expression. "There she is," he said softly, "the Moon Warden's daughter. Do you have any idea how much simpler my life would have been if your mother had simply died quietly, all those years ago, instead of hiding you well enough that it's taken me this long to finish what I started?" "You killed her," Sigrid said, and her voice came out shaking with a fury that surprised even her. "You killed my father, my mother. You cursed me before I was even old enough to understand what I'd lost." "I removed threats," Malric corrected, almost pleasant about it. "Your mother helped prove treason against me, to a council that would have seen me executed for a crown that was rightfully mine from birth. I did what any man would do, faced with losing everything to a brother who was simply born from the more convenient mother." Behind Sigrid, Tobin whimpered, and Soren shifted his grip on his garden knife, planting himself between his youngest brother and the man in the doorway, with a courage that made Sigrid's chest ache, even through her terror. "Get away from them," she said. "Or what?" Malric's smile was thin, almost curious. "You have no wolf, girl. Whatever your bloodline was meant to become, it clearly never finished waking. I made certain of that myself, the night I bound your line's power along with your parents' silence." He took a step closer. "You're exactly what your pack always said you were. Nothing." Something old and coiled and furious rose up in Sigrid's chest at that word, a word she had carried like a stone around her neck for 18 years, a word this man had, quite literally, cursed into her before she was even old enough to understand what he'd stolen. "You're wrong," she said. "Am I? You bound my wolf because you were afraid of what I'd become if it ever woke," Sigrid said, and felt the ground beneath her feet begin, impossibly, to hum. "You didn't curse a nothing, Malric. You cursed someone dangerous enough that you had to murder 2 people and bind a child just to feel safe." Malric lunged for Tobin, and something in Sigrid, 18 years of being told she was worthless, a curse, laid the night her parents died, to keep her small and silent forever. Every ounce of love she had found in this house full of grieving boys who had finally, cautiously, let her in, broke free all at once. The change tore through her like lightning finding ground, bone and fur and fire, faster and fiercer than any wolf born the ordinary way, silver white and enormous. And Sigrid Emberholt, wolfless no longer, never truly wolfless at all, met Malric's charge head-on and drove him bodily back through the shattered wall and out into the courtyard beyond. The fight that followed was brief and brutal and utterly one-sided. Whatever power Malric had bound inside her for 18 years came roaring out all at once, and he had no answer for it. Tyan arrived in time to see his brother go down beneath a wolf larger and fiercer than either of them had believed possible, held pinned and helpless in the dirt of his own ruined ambition. "Enough," Tyan said, human again, breathing hard, standing over his brother with a fury tempered, barely, by something that still remembered what it was to love him once, a long time ago. "It's finished, Malric. Whatever you believed you were owed, it ends here, tonight." Guards moved in to bind him. Malric didn't resist. He simply stared up at Sigrid, silver white and magnificent in the moonlight, and for the first time since she'd met him, looked genuinely afraid. Sigrid shifted back, human and shaking, and suddenly, overwhelmingly exhausted, and Tyan was there instantly, catching her before her knees buckled, pulling her against his chest as the last of the mercenaries were rounded up around them. "You shifted," he breathed against her hair. "Sigrid, you shifted." "I know," she managed, half laughing, half sobbing with the release of 18 years of grief and fear, finally breaking loose all at once. "I know." Behind them, 8 boys stood in the wreckage of the nursery wing, staring at the woman who had run into a flooding river for 2 of them, defended a poisoned sword for a 3rd, and had just torn free of a lifelong curse to stand between the rest of them and the man who'd murdered their mother. None of them called her a stranger anymore. The Grand Hall of Ravenspire had never held a wedding before, not in 12 generations of Draven kings, and Sigrid stood at its threshold 6 months later, with her heart hammering harder than it had the night she'd faced Malric down in wolf form. "You look terrified," Torvin said beside her, offering his arm with a grin that had become easily his own these past months. As the eldest, he'd insisted on the honor of walking her down the aisle himself, a request that had made Sigrid cry the first time he'd made it, and made her cry again now, hearing him say it so lightly. "Father's the one who should be nervous. I've never seen him this unsettled negotiating with a room full of hostile kings." "I am nervous," Sigrid admitted. "Good nervous, though. I don't think I knew there was a difference until this house taught me." Through the open doors, she could see all of them waiting. Cassian, straight-backed and solemn, entrusted with the rings and clearly terrified of dropping them. The twins, who'd spent the morning arguing about whose fault it would be if the doves they'd insisted on releasing flew off in the wrong direction. Edric, holding a small leather notebook he swore was simply for documentation purposes, and not, as everyone suspected, because he found weddings deeply moving and wanted an excuse to look busy instead of teary. Soren, with a rescued fox pup, curled improbably in his arms, despite everyone's firm instructions that the ceremony was not, in fact, the appropriate venue. Wulfric, who had finally, over these 6 months, become a boy who talked freely and laughed loudly, and had asked, with great seriousness, whether he could call her mother once the wedding was official. And Tobin, small and delighted, clutching his wooden wolf with its carefully mended ear, already halfway down the aisle before anyone could stop him, utterly unable to wait his turn. And at the end of it all, Tian, the Alpha King who had crossed 3 borders for a girl the world had called worthless, who had learned, over 6 long months, how to be a father again, instead of only a king, standing at the altar, with an expression that made every ounce of Sigrid's nervousness dissolve into something warm and certain instead. Malric had been sentenced to the deep cells beneath Ashfall's northern fortress rather than execution, a decision Tian had wrestled with for weeks, torn between the justice his brother's crimes demanded and the strange, stubborn thread of old love that made him unable, in the end, to end a life he'd once shared a childhood with. Sigrid had supported that choice, not out of forgiveness, but out of the hard-won understanding that some kinds of mercy were less about the person receiving them and more about the person choosing to give them. "I don't want to become someone who answers cruelty with more of the same," she'd told Tian, the night he'd finally decided. "I spent too many years being told I was worthless by people who never once questioned whether that cruelty made them small. I don't want to build our life on the same foundation." Now, walking down the aisle on Torvin's arm, past every person who had once been a stranger and had slowly, one broken bridge and one act of trust at a time, become a family, Sigrid felt the truth of that choice settle over her like warmth after a long winter. The ceremony was, by any formal measure, chaos. Tobin dropped the ring cushion twice. The twins' doves did, in fact, fly in the entirely wrong direction, directly over the head of a visiting dignitary who did not take it well. Soren's fox pup escaped his arms halfway through the vows and had to be chased down by Edric, notebook abandoned, dignity thoroughly compromised. Wulfric cried happy tears loudly enough that half the hall was laughing before the ceremony even reached its end. It was, Sigrid thought, watching all of it unfold with her hand in Tian's, the single most perfect thing she had ever witnessed. "Do you, Tian Draven, take this woman?" "I do," Tian said, before the officiant had even finished the question, drawing startled laughter from the hall and a warm, exasperated smile from Sigrid that he answered with one of his own. The smile she'd learned, over these 6 months, was reserved only for her. "And do you, Sigrid Emberholt?" "I do," she said, and meant it with every scarred, healed, finally whole piece of a heart that had spent 18 years being told it wasn't worth the keeping. That night, as the celebration spilled out across the courtyard where, 6 months earlier, a battle had nearly cost this family everything, Tian pulled her close beneath a sky full of stars and asked, quietly, "Any regrets, my queen?" Sigrid looked around at 8 boys, who called her family now without hesitation, at a man who had crossed 3 borders to find her and had never once stopped choosing her since, at a life built not despite every broken piece of her past, but entirely out of them. "Not one," she said, "not a single one." Somewhere in the crowd, Tobin's laughter rang out bright and clear, and Sigrid Emberholt, Queen of Ashfall, once called Wolfless, once called worthless, once told by an entire kingdom that she was nothing worth keeping, understood, finally and completely, that every wolf who had ever mocked her for what she lacked had simply never had the patience to see what she carried instead. It had taken a king crossing 3 borders to find her. It had taken 8 boys teaching her how to be needed. And it had taken her own broken, unbreakable heart to finally, fully answer the moon. Every great story leaves a few questions behind. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, subscribe for more stories every week, and tell me your ending in the comments. I read as many comments as I can. Thanks for watching.